On this episode of the Dairyland Initiative podcast, we're going to be talking about cooling cows with water. Hi, I'm Courtney Hallbach.
And I'm Nigel Cook.
And this is the Dairyland Initiative podcast,
where we get to discuss issues related to the housing and management of dairy cattle.
Let's dive in. Well, thank you so much again for joining us, Dr. Jennifer Van Oss. It was great having you on couple of episodes ago, I think, where we were talking about not the thermoneutral zone, but the thermal comfort zone of individual cows, and how individual cows respond to heat stress varies, which I think is really important. That's not something we often talk about.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for having me back. And I like to challenge assumptions.
Yeah, and so today we're going to do that again. The Dairyland Initiative has been known for ventilation and providing fast-moving air for heat abatement purposes, but one area we don't talk a lot about is water. And we do know that there's benefits with combining water with air speeds and figuring out, on the farm where we should do that. But if I remember correctly, you have a really nice Veterinary Clinics of North America chapter that's out there on the internet with some really valuable advice for water and cooling cows with water.
Yeah, well, thanks for the compliment. Dr. Cook asked me to write that, and I'm happy that you find it useful.
I really do. Today I kind of wanted to get a general overview, your thoughts on using water to cool cows. I know you have some myths that we should try and bust today.
Yeah.
So I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, yeah, let's challenge those assumptions.
Yeah, so what the assumptions are, misters and soakers, they're the same, right?
So, yeah, I hear people use those terms interchangeably a lot, and I would like to separate out those terms because I think that word choice does make a difference. Mm-hmm. So, sprinklers, showers, misters, soakers, spray, we often hear these terms used interchangeably. Yeah. I would say spray is the most general. If you're spraying water out of something, that's water cooling with spray. But soakers, showers, sprinklers are often used interchangeably, and I'm okay with that. Okay. Misters or foggers are something different.
Yeah.
So with misters and foggers, we're talking fine droplets, high pressure in the water line, and so you're generating this fine spray. And actually the main cooling mechanism, how misters and foggers work, is you're trying to cool the air surrounding the animal. Yeah, I was about to say,
you're not
trying to directly get them wet. Yeah, and so if you're like eating at a restaurant and they have mister nozzles, they're not trying to soak you while you're having brunch on a terrace, right? They're just trying to cool the air, so it's almost like outdoor air conditioning. Yeah. But that is dependent on the water holding capacity of the air.
Yeah, so I feel like it's 85 degrees humidity outside today here in Wisconsin. I'm guessing misters wouldn't be the best option.
Yeah, so we here in Wisconsin are in what's called a humid continental climate, so we're characterized by warm or hot summers with high relative humidity. So I would say in general in Wisconsin, misters are not going to be the best approach because the air is already holding a lot of vapor.
Of water.
But it can be good for drier environments, so Mediterranean or arid climates. That would be a good way to try to cool the air around the animal. But probably on its own still wouldn't be the best. So that's why a lot of times around here, we're not really talking about misters or foggers. We're really thinking, okay, if we're going to supplement our other cooling methods like fans, which I'm a fan of. So understandably, the Dairyland Initiative talks mostly about ventilation and less so about water soaking because in a humid continental climate, maybe not this summer. This summer has been really hot, like unusually hot. But I would say we often see farms successfully manage thermal discomfort and heat stress in their cattle using just mechanical ventilation. Yeah. But these tools can work together. So if you're looking at water soaking, that can be an additional way to just give this extra boost and further actively cool your animals.
So what do you mean by soaking?
So soaking is what it sounds like. There you're trying to directly wet the animal themselves. So not just cooling the air, but I want to come back to that actually because soakers also do that. Okay. So the goal there is to directly wet the animal's skin. Mm-hmm. And so then it's the heat from her body that's causing the water to change from a liquid to a vapor state. Yeah. And so that energy then pulls the heat away from the cow's body back into the environment, allowing her to dissipate heat. So the idea is you're directly wetting the animal. But I guess in terms of challenging assumptions, pens, people often approach this like an engineering problem. So exactly how much water, what temperature does it need to be to remove this amount of calories from the animal, treating them like some static equation, right? But animals are biological entities, and so it's not just about achieving a certain amount of energy exchange. We also need to factor in how does that affect the animal's comfort, so their perception, their welfare, and their behavior. And so this is why it's not just a problem for engineers. Like, engineers can help us think through these equations and how we can approach the problem, but I think it's also important to think like an animal scientist and somebody who studies animal behavior to think about, well, what is it actually doing for their welfare?
Yeah.
And one of the assumptions I want to challenge, which actually isn't even an animal behavior one, is like, how are soakers actually functioning? So the idea is you should be wetting the animal and then they evaporate this water from the body surface, and that helps them dissipate heat. But when we're talking about soaker nozzles, all nozzles output a spectrum of droplet sizes.
Yeah.
So even though with soakers we're talking about large or coarse droplets compared to misters or fogger, which are small or fine droplets,
fine.
that's on average. So there's this whole bell curve, and even a soaker nozzle is going to have some fine droplets accompanying them, which means you're also potentially cooling the air around the animal.
Yeah.
And we can measure this. We found that the microclimate when you're using soakers is cooler than if the soakers are off, for example. So that's already two mechanisms. And then the third mechanism is if you're wetting the animal directly with water that's cooler than their skin temperature, which usually it is, unless the water's been sitting still in a hot water line out in the sun. Usually that water's going to be cooler than their body temperature. So there's actually some direct heat exchange from fluid convection. So there's three mechanisms by which soakers can cool cows.
And where are some of the common places that we see soakers on farm?
That's going to depend on the region and therefore the facility design. So two of the most common areas would be in the cattle's home pen directly.
Over
So
the
for
feed
example,
bunk, right?
yeah, if we're thinking like lactating cows, there would be a water line over the feed bunk, and the idea is then you're directly wetting the animals while they're eating. Although behaviorally what we see is if they're seeking out that cooling, then they might spend a lot of time standing there without eating.
Ah.
And we can come back to the pros and cons of
Yeah.
that. And so the idea is if they're spending most of their day in the home pen, this way you can cool them where they're spending a lot of time. Another common place where we see water soaking is in the holding pen for the milking parlor. And there are some pros and cons of that practice as well. Less common, but I've seen actually a couple of instances, would be directly showering cows while they're being milked in the milking parlor.
Yeah, you've had, when you first started here at the UW,
Yeah.
joined up with a farm just...
But I heard you
45
were there today.
I was
Yeah.
there today, and they saw me in my nice clothes, and we didn't get any manure on me, so it was a
Wow.
win-win. But you were looking at that use of water in the parlor, and
Right.
I'd say from what I've heard in the industry, people are concerned about water dripping down and getting on the teats. Was
Yeah.
that an issue in this
That was a
trial?
concern that this farm raised. So they designed it with their plumber, and they installed actual shower heads over each milking stall. And so it was a totally custom design. And because they were concerned about getting water onto the teats, they had the shower heads behind the cow, so over their rear end, with the idea that that way the spray would be angled to just wet their backs.
Okay.
But
Without
when
hitting her head.
without getting on the head, and we can also talk about why I think that that's a good idea. But unfortunately, it meant that when the showers were turned off, as the water was like coming out of the pipes, it would start to dribble. And so then some of the water actually would get on their tails. And then the tail would rip around, and then sometimes actually you would see some water on the udder, but I still don't necessarily think that that's actually a big concern. So I spoke with another farm here in Wisconsin recently that had a similar idea. And so they're planning to also install showers in their parlor. And I suggested they think about mounting them in the opposite orientation. So over the cows' necks and then spraying onto their backs,
Yeah.
making sure not to spray into the parlor pit. And they said that's what they were already planning to do.
Okay.
And so they wouldn't spray their heads, but that way you wouldn't get the dribbling water down the back.
Would you use water in both the holding area and the parlor, prioritize one or the other?
So some of the pros and cons, when I talked to this farm who has had the parlor showers for a number of years, they said they used to do this holding pen soaking, but they didn't like it for a couple of reasons. So the first reason is we know that the amount of cows filling up the holding area varies.
Yep.
So sometimes the holding area is empty, And
you're just
if the soakers are
wasting water.
triggered, yeah, exactly. If the soakers are triggered based on an air temperature threshold, then they're totally wasting water. And they said actually when the holding pen was full, even though in theory they would be soaking all of those cows, the cows would be really packed in closely together. And so there might actually not be even soaking depending on how much of their back was accessible to the spray. And they also saw some evidence that the cows were trying to avoid it. So even though there was this benefit that the water in theory should keep them cool, they got this sense their cows didn't like it.
Interesting.
And
But moving that water to the parlor stall, they didn't seem bothered by it?
I think maybe it was hard for them to tell. They assumed the cows didn't have a problem with it, but they're also kind of restricted in where they can move. But that's something that we tried to help them answer. So when we did this study, we mounted cameras to record the cows' reactions, which took some of the same measurements we had done in previous research on home pen soaking. So we looked at things like what posture is the cow holding her head, and how much is she flicking her ears or shaking her head. And there we didn't find evidence of this kind of avoidance behavior. So from what we could tell, it seemed like the cows were used to it and good with it. And part of what we think was happening in the home pen, again, going back to some of the previous research that I had done during my PhD and others have done, is that it seems like they specifically don't want to be sprayed on the head. So including in New Zealand, some of the research that was done there, when they're being soaked in this holding pen setting, we'd see this very low head posture, like they're trying to keep their head as far away from the spray as they can. And it's similar to the behavior that they would show outdoors in the rain.
Okay, so
I think the farmers were right. I think they were onto something.
Yeah. And now the other concern that I've heard is just that water dripping down onto the udder. What do you say about that?
I have a few thoughts about that. So first of all, if you look at how a cow is shaped and how the path that water would follow, generally, if the water is running down her sides, it can't run back up to then get onto the udder. That if the spray is coming from above, it doesn't actually hit the udder that much. I would be more concerned if the tail is getting really wet and then smearing it around. But there also are holding pen washes that we see out west in some of these dairies where that's kind of a common practice, and I don't think there's actually any published evidence that would increase the risk for mastitis. I understand if it's not in people's personal comfort zone, but I think this concern about water dripping down the sides and somehow magically getting onto the teats, it's a bit overblown.
What about getting onto the bedding? So if you're soaking at a feed bunk, is there enough time for that water to dissipate before she lays back down in a nice sand-bedded stall?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, too, where it could depend on how much time has passed, if she's still actively dripping before she goes and lies down. I think that's one of the good things about sand is that it is inorganic.
Yeah.
But there have been a couple of studies published where they were looking at cooling methods using water over the stalls. So I think that's probably not the wisest idea.
Yeah.
You don't want to be directly applying water to the stall.
Yeah.
But I don't think that there's any documented direct evidence that soaking as a practice itself increases the risk of mastitis. Instead, what studies have shown is that there's seasonal variation where somatic cell count just increases in the summer.
Yep.
But that could be for reasons other than using soaking.
Yeah. And so getting back to using soakers at the feed bunk, are there any benefits in terms of increased lying times or any relations there?
Sadly, no. I know. And this is why I'm a fan of fans. So as we talked about last episode, one of the favorite studies that we did, and actually, I'm going to digress. We talked last time about our favorite set of studies where we saw that mechanical ventilation from fans over the stalls or properly placed baffles, for example, in a mechanical cross-ventilated barn could not only reduce heat stress, improve milk production, but also increase lying time.
Yeah.
And I acknowledge your collaboration. I acknowledge the farm staff at our research facility who helped us through the pandemic. But I forgot to mention that this was by my former PhD student, Kim Reuscher. It was part of her PhD thesis. And I really want to acknowledge her. And same thing when we talked about some of the CAF work, looking at thresholds for respiration rates, the work in Florida and here. That was by Dr. Bethany Dadosen, which was one of Dr. Laporta's former PhD students. I really want to acknowledge the people who are doing the bulk of the work.
Those students
and
are
I apologize for that oversight.
Yes. In getting the data, doing the day-to-day hardcore stuff, and then working with people like you and Dr. Laporta as advisors. I mean, it's definitely a teamwork, but yes, these students are the
Absolutely.
ones that are out
And
collecting
I just
the
want to
data.
say that I think I was just out of my mind that day because I was really heat stressed. So that was June. This is late July, and astute observers may note that I'm wearing the same shirt. I actually own more than one shirt.
I really hope
It's
so.
just the one that my subconscious chooses for Dairyland Initiative podcast.
It has been laundered since,
but no,
correct?
absolutely, no blazer today.
Nope, it's a
It's
hot
too
one.
hot.
It's way too hot. And I'm
So that's my
also,
excuse.
as we're talking about water, I'm thinking I really would like to jump into our Lake Mendota right now.
Oh yeah.
But there's a podcast to record. So the feed bunk research.
Yes. Oh yeah. Soakers.
Soakers.
Right. So soakers have not been shown to improve lying time. So instead, we talked about last time, many studies have found across different climate regions and experiment types that as the weather gets hotter, cows spend less time lying down per day. But that's not improved if they have soakers. So our study where we had these properly calibrated fans over the free stalls has been the only study so far that has found a heat abatement method that can improve lying time in hot weather. Mm-hmm. So even though soakers have been shown to be really effective at rapidly dropping respiration rate and body temperature, restoring dry matter intake and milk yield, unfortunately they don't seem to help with lying time. And so this is where we think maybe it's something about natural behavior and cows' evolutionary history that they're responding behaviorally to wind speed.
Yeah.
But we see these other behavioral reactions to rain where they're trying to avoid it, right? We talked about with their head lowering. And so maybe it just doesn't affect their lying behavior in that way. So we're kind of trying to work with cow behavior, right? So they definitely are capable of learning. They learn to use the soakers, but it doesn't seem to influence their resting behavior.
And so in terms of where we should put soakers, I've heard the feed bunk in most likely a naturally ventilated barn. I haven't seen too many soakers in mechanically ventilated facilities. The holding area, the parlor.
But sometimes when I'm talking about heat abatement, in my mind, I have kind of like a priority list. So step one is always provide shade, which I think, again, for our listeners here in Wisconsin, they're probably thinking, well, duh.
Yeah, that's simple.
If you have a barn roof, you have shade.
Yeah.
But that's not a given depending on the region or the production system. Or sometimes there will be a shade, like in a dry lot corral, but there's not always shade over the feed bunk.
Correct. Yeah.
Where the soakers would be. And so I would start with shade, and that's for a couple of reasons. So the first is if you don't have shade, then the cows are still gaining heat from solar radiation. So even if you're providing active cooling like fans or soakers or both, you're like fighting yourself.
Yeah.
So you need to prevent heat gain and also dissipate heat. So you need to do both. The second reason is because there's been a lot of research showing, again, we're working with cows' natural behavior. Mm-hmm. They really like shade. They think it's important. They're highly motivated to gain access to it. They prefer it. It's just something important to provide for just basic animal welfare. So step one is shade. Step two then is active cooling. So here in our humid continental climate, I would look for high-speed air first.
Yeah, air movement first.
And actually that farm where we evaluated their parlor cooling system that they had designed, so they're the ones who came up with that idea. They were really happy with it, but we just came to take these systematic measurements and kind of corroborate their instinct that they had come up with a good design. But what we had noticed was that their parlor showers, I think, were a good thing because they gave the cows that extra boost. It allowed them to quickly reduce their respiration rates, but their body temperatures were actually already in the normal range. Yeah. So last time when we talked about, cows are warm-blooded, they need to maintain homeothermy, so their body temperatures in a narrow range. Their body temperatures were already good, and I think that's because they had pretty well-designed barn ventilation systems. But then layering the soaking on top of that was like the icing on the cake for thermal comfort.
I love it.
Yes. So they were maintaining homeothermy. They might have been maintaining thermoneutrality. We couldn't measure that directly because that's about the body heat that they're producing or the metabolic heat. But then we saw evidence that those soakers helped with thermal comfort. And so I think that I like that approach where you start with shade. You add on high-speed air, which also helps with lying time. And then if you see signs that respiration rates are still too high, then you layer in soaking.
It's almost like you read my mind because I was going to ask, when should we put soaking systems on farm? And you were...
I think that soakers can be really useful, but they're not a first resort.
I like that.
I think you see how well your system's working for you and then consider escalating to soaking.
And I think part of the thing that we need to be conscious of is water usage on farm. And so soakers might not be the number one choice.
They're not for everyone because they create a wet environment. And so when I was working in California, every year was this new historical drought.
Yep.
And it seemed like it was lasting forever. And here we're less concerned most years about water quantity, but then you have to manage that water in
where
the
does
barn.
that water
Where does
go?
it go? Exactly. So that's still a consideration. Even if our source of water is plentiful, then we have to deal with the runoff. And also, I think my second concern, I kind of hinted at this earlier, is with soakers, cows learn. They learn that the soakers cool them. So if you have them over the feed bunk, what we see is that cows will go there. They will increase their eating time and the dry matter intake with soakers present, but then they'll spend more time just standing there, not eating, just standing under the soakers on wet concrete.
I was actually at a farm yesterday in a naturally ventilated facility with fans over the stalls and soakers over the feed bunk. And there were plenty of cows not eating, just standing at the feed bunk, showing signs of heat stress, but actively looking for that.
Trying to get cool. Yeah. But what they weren't doing was lying down.
Exactly.
Right.
And
so
that's not what we'd like to see.
Exactly. So we want to try to promote that adequate resting time, because if they're spending all that time standing up and standing on wet concrete, I would be concerned that that's increasing their risk for lameness that you would then see a few months later.
Yeah. So getting back to soakers and droplet size, is there an ideal size that farmers should be providing?
Yeah, I think that that's a good question because, okay, so I'm going to digress and tell a little story, which was during my PhD. I was actually trying to evaluate, like, is there an optimal way to deliver soaker spray because we were in a drought? So we're trying to balance adequate cooling and animal welfare and productivity against water use. So the way you manipulate the amount of water that's sprayed on a cow is through a combination of time and flow rate, because rate is just the amount of gallons or liters per second or per minute. So to provide more water, you could either spray for longer or use a higher output nozzle.
Makes sense.
So the nozzles that I was testing, they have a standardized color regardless of the brand.
Oh.
So there's red ones, green ones, blue ones. And so the ones I was testing, like the high flow nozzles are green, and the lower flow soaker, they're still soaker nozzles, they're red. And this is just an agricultural engineering thing. So you buy these nozzles and they're not just used on dairy farms to cool cows at the feed line.
Industry-wide.
You can you would be using them on like machinery in a cropping setting. So they're just like standardized. But somebody got really upset with me that I chose red and green. And they thought I was trying to, but they also thought I was trying to give cows a cue, like green is good because it has more water and red is bad or something, or they were worried about color blindness. And I was like, I didn't make them this way.
Yeah.
This is just a standardized color. It's just the way things are. So just a little side note.
Yeah, funny side note.
So if you're thinking in terms of the nozzle colors, what we were trying to balance there was if you standardize the amount of time and you're applying more water in that same unit of time, what's the right amount? As sort of a side question, we were also thinking about droplet size. And the reason for that is because there's this pervasive myth in the industry that small droplets are bad. And there's a few reasons people say this. And the first is the smaller droplets are more likely to drift before they land on the cow. So it can be inefficient or it can land on the feed, which we don't want the feed to get all wet. But also, thinking about what I said earlier, these really tiny droplets also can evaporate before they land on the cow, and there actually are potential cooling benefits for that, depending on the relative humidity.
Yeah.
But the other reason is because people started citing this idea that if you have small droplets, they will create an insulating barrier. So then you're trapping air, kind of like when you're wearing a jacket. The way that the jacket keeps you warm is it creates this little layer of air between your skin and the
outside
insulation. Yeah. And so there was this myth that like the smaller the droplets, they'll just rest on the tips of the hair until they form this film of water, and then you'll be trapping the heat. And so during my PhD, I tried to trace this down. Like, why do people say this? Is there anything to it? Because it kept getting cited. And so I went back, okay, this person cited this person had cited this, and I traced it all the way back. And it was actually somebody saying smaller droplets are just less efficient because if they rest on the tips of the hair, that's not where the body heat is being dissipated from. It's being dissipated from the animal's skin. And that's why you want the bigger, heavier droplets, because then they go through the hair onto the skin, and that way it's the body heat that's actually causing that energy exchange and not the air temperature.
So did you disprove this?
So I was able to go back in literature and show this original person wasn't saying it creates an insulating layer. That was just a misinterpretation.
Okay.
But in terms of like, does it actually matter when we're talking about soaker nozzles? So these red, green, and blue. So not foggers or misters, but actually soakers. Again, all nozzles put out a spectrum of droplet sizes. So what they publish is actually called VMD, volume medium diameter. And I won't explain the technical details, but essentially like that's the technical specification that's published. But remember, there's always a spectrum, and there's also a lot of overlap. So when we're talking about the red, green, or blue nozzles, it's not actually that big of a difference in the types of droplet sizes that you're representing. And we found that all of these effectively cool cows. And so one of the conclusions that I had from my PhD work is that droplet size actually doesn't vary that much once you're talking about soaker nozzles, and it's really the amount of water.
So you're not going to tell me that I need a red, green, blue, yellow nozzle?
I think that what we concluded is there is more spray drift with the red nozzle. So we did actually try to quantify like how much of it is drifting. And so the blue or the green on average have larger droplets, but you then have to calibrate how long you're leaving them on so you don't waste water. If you have water that has a lot of mineral content, the way you manipulate the flow rate, it's with the orifice size. So the blue nozzle is going to have a larger hole than the red one, and the green one has a larger hole than the blue one. So the larger the orifice, the less likely it'll be to get clogged. So I think that's another advantage.
Okay, to leave us, do you have a fun fact about water?
So one thing that when I visit farms and I ask them, what are your animal welfare concerns? What do you think we should be studying? Everybody has been really upset about flies recently.
Oh my goodness, yes.
And one of the fun things that my research and other people's research has found is that when you use soakers, cows show less insect avoidance behavior. So we didn't directly measure whether it's deterring the flies, but the cows seem to show less of this like irritation response. So we think that the soakers are also keeping the flies from landing on the cows while they're at the feed bunk. And so I think this is an area we should study more.
I was going to say,
there is a newer professor here at UW-Madison, Emily Bick, and she made something that's called like the insect eavesdropper. And she's studying it with calves right now, collaborating with Penn State. So they're trying to quantify fly load using acoustics, like bioacoustics.
Wow.
And they're cross-referencing it with video recordings of the number of flies. And so I feel like this is something that we could potentially study.
This was not on my bingo card for this podcast, talking about flies. But hey, you never know.
And we can tie that together with bunching, which I know is one of Dr. Cook's pet peeves. So I think there's more avenues that we can explore.
Okay. Well, I really appreciate you coming back on for this.
Thank you for having me.
Episode.
It's always a pleasure.
Maybe we'll have you again some other time. Anyways, thanks again for tuning in to the Dairyland Initiative podcast, and we'll see you next time. The Dairyland Initiative is supported by industry leaders who are advancing cow comfort worldwide. We would like to say a special thank you to our premier sponsor, Saputo, who is providing the global community with high-quality dairy products made from high-quality milk from healthy and well-cared-for animals. We'd also like to say thank you to our other sponsors, SaveCows.com, Zinpro, GPS Dairy Consulting, 40 Barn, SureGain Trow Nutrition, Munters, J&D Manufacturing, VES Artex, Ventec, and Kestrel Instruments. Thanks for tuning in to the Dairyland Initiative podcast. Want more Dairyland Initiative? Be sure to subscribe to our podcast, follow us on our socials, and visit our website for all of the latest recommendations in dairy cattle housing and management. See you next time.